All right, thank you. I'd like to call this operations work group meeting to order on June 12th, 2023. To kick us off, I'll provide a brief review of the 10 written comments that we received before tonight's meeting. All 10 are in support of restoring the position for Operation Fresh Start. Beyond that, we have 5 public speakers, and I will start with Greg Markle.
Thank you. Where should I speak from?
You can come sit at the table. The microphone's in the ceiling, so feel free to just project a little.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Greg Markle, and I'm here for a couple of reasons. One is I'm the proud parent of a graduated senior at La Follette High School. So thank you for the wonderful opportunity and education which she received at La Follette. It was special for her, it was meaningful for her, and I appreciate everything the school board and administration has done to make that possible. I'm also here, mainly here, as Executive Director of Operation Fresh Start, which has a long-standing, deep relationship with MMSD, and we really appreciate that as well. But I'm really here to speak for those young people who didn't have the experience my daughter had. They're young people who end up at Operation Fresh Start. And they're young people who weren't succeeding in a traditional high school. They're more tactile learners. They have difficulties in a traditional education system and a traditional way of administering an education system. They're also the ones most negatively impacted from COVID and continue to be most negatively impacted from COVID. In my conversations with them now of why they ended up in Fresh Start, almost always the first thing they say was, those schools were just too crowded. I couldn't take those people, that many people, that much distraction. But they come to Fresh Start and they succeed. Before you is an amendment to restore a half-time position, an MMSD position at Operation Fresh Start. It's important because it makes our programming better. It makes the opportunities for those young people better. On the other side, you have a desire for all alternative programs to be administered the same and not have staff in those programs. Our young people have faced that obstacle of everything being administered the same, and it's netted them a bad result. Please don't make that mistake again. Our young people need something administered differently. What makes the relationship important, that partnership really important, is not just that one halftime person who is an MMSD staff person halftime and an OFS person the other half the time. It's what he brings to the overall program. In addition to the MMSD resources, Operation Fresh Start goes out and garners about $1 million to support MMSD students at OFS. What that relationship with MSD brings is all the in-service training, the opportunities to learn about Zello, the opportunities to learn about how to identify students' needs. All of those things come from MMSD, and they go through Eric to the entire staff surrounding the young people who are MMSD students at OFS. It's a huge factor. Reducing this, frankly, will save MMSD about $12,000. Eric's already lined up to take a halftime chemistry job at La Follette. With that, he'll only be able to work about 45% at OFS. Our line is 50% for benefits. So you'll take over as benefits. Your savings about $12,000 for what? A worse opportunity for young people, and perhaps not even fitting the necessary requirements or the philosophy between opportunities for special ed and alternative education. So please support this amendment. I'd love to talk to you further if you have any questions about OFS or would like to visit. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next public speaker is Ms. Zorelli.
All right. Hello, board. I'm a proud, and everybody else out there, and Michelle, I'm wearing my red shirt again, not blue, just so you know. I'm a proud MMSD graduate, resident, and teacher here. I'm here again to show you that I and MTI are here and committed to work with you to make MMSD the best district for all of our students to thrive at. I wanted to be here in person today to make sure to thank you all. To thank you for listening and voting on the 8% cost of living adjustment. I want to say it's even bigger, and to thank you that you did it before contracts are due by the end of this week. This is huge for staff retention, and it will definitely help with recruiting staff in the district. We still need to work together to get fully staffed schools for August 24th Welcome Back Days, so everyone is trained, prepared, and ready for day one with our students. The number one best recruitment tactic is word of mouth. We need everyone spreading the word that MMSD is the best district around. And for this to happen, we can't cut 155 jobs to staff who are directly working with students in our buildings. Cuts should be made at other positions who don't work in our schools every day. We need to look to hire more psychologists, social workers, and counselors to match the ALCU ratios. We need to change the handbook's language around to guarantee guarded PCT planning time on Mondays. Teachers need to have time to give feedback in a timely manner to students and parents, and to modify lessons to make them best fit their current students in front of them so they get the best education possible. I just want to thank you guys again for listening and your willingness to work with us and team with us to make MMSD the best district around. Thank you, guys.
Our next speaker is Mr. Jones.
Thank you. I wanted to start with a moment of gratitude. Like my colleague Andrea, as president of MTI, someone who's been in the discussions for a very long time with people not only on this board but within the district administration. We know 8% is a risk. It's not a panacea for all the ills that we encounter as a district, but it's a risk and an investment worth taking. And I just wanted to say thank you for doing all those things that Andrea said. I have visited at least a dozen schools since the 8% was publicly declared. And I cannot tell you how many more conversations I was having about people getting ready for next year, things they want to do, ways they want to get better, ways they want to improve, as opposed to ways they're trying to get out. And not only teachers, but custodians, educational support professionals, security. Everyone was asking, am I part of the students? Like for everyone. And people are ready for next year, or feeling ready for next year. That does not mean that we will not continue to fight for our custodial brothers and sisters in their fight for $5, which they deserve. It doesn't mean we're not going to fight for better class sizes and more educator autonomy, and the restoration of even at the smallest of building levels in terms of like restoration of the position at OFS. We will continue to stand side by side and fight for those things because that's the right thing to do. But that doesn't mean that we won't be going in it alone. In your 8% investment in this community means that we can do it on a more unified front, and with a focus less on adversarial relationships, but more on healing, especially as we wrestle with topics together like healthcare and trying to engender a more radical vision for our schools and for all of our learners and for all the people in our community that perhaps our current school model doesn't do. I also wanted to just use this time to personally thank those members of the administration who will not be returning next year, especially Dr. Carlton Jenkins for his service. This has been one of the most difficult periods in the history of, I would argue, our world, and for someone to come in and lead with grace and humanity is not easy. And a lot of times we had a lot of adversarial conversations, but that doesn't mean that didn't recognize that he was always trying to do what was right by people. And we look forward to cultivating a similar relationship with Dr. Vistad. So thank you.
And our next speaker is online, but we have Ms. Gomez Schmidt on Zoom.
Hi all, can you hear me and see me? Yes?
Yes.
Oh, okay, thank you. I can see you barely. And I apologize that I did not make it in person. I was on my way and am stopped in traffic. And so I stopped alongside the road so I could safely participate. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all. Just want to say in advance that I have incredible respect for the difficult situation and jobs you are doing as board members to balance all of the competing things that are needed and the investment that is needed in our district. I do want to say I am here to address the current draft of the budget that you'll vote on at the end of June. Last week included big news for the MMSD budget, both on the spending side and the revenue side. And I'm grateful for the increase in spending on public schools that the legislature and governor worked out. I unfortunately think the fight over CPI and how much will be paid to staff is a misplaced fight when it is really about a state level funding. Unfortunately, I do agree with Mike Jones that your decision to go all the way to 8% plus the 2% steps and lanes for an average of 10% actually does inject a huge amount of risk, not necessarily into this budget for this year, but into budgets going forward. And I guess I'd like to say and just ask that we've talked about transparency a lot this year. I think you all, as you lead up to the vote at the end of June, are going to have to be pretty transparent about how you intend to pay for all of the investments that are going to be needed going forward. And if you're deciding to prioritize base wage above all else, I think we are going to have to be very realistic about the things that you won't be able to invest in going forward in the future. And let me see. We have talked for 2 years about the fiscal cliff ahead when ESSER funds expire, and that will be next year. That's also the last year of the 2020 operating referendum. And while you may be planning to go to referendum to ask the taxpayers to support increasing taxes to fund our schools, I don't think you know yet how much that ask will need to be when the increase is included among other funding needs. Most likely inflation won't be zero next year and you want to continue to invest in staffing. New healthcare contracts will need to be negotiated and are guaranteed to cost a lot based on what we learned from the GHC issue this year. And enrollment is predicted to continue to decline. I think it's become complicated in the last 2 years where no increase was provided and we relied on our operations referendum to expand our revenue limit and the one-time federal funds. But those things have created a very real fiscal cliff. And I'm hoping, again, my message is that you are super transparent with the public and taxpayers about where the future funding is going to come from and what investments are going to be possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And our final public speaker is Mr. Larson.
Thank you, and thank you, board. I also wanted to thank you. The 8% across the board is very helpful. However, we're still left behind, and I think I've been speaking on this for months, and I think we've all came to the conclusion that once everybody understood all the duties will be completed, then we've certainly earned the $5 raise. I think we've also come to the conclusion that in the fiscal that we found ourselves in the district, the raise for the custodial unit is just a fraction of that. It's a small portion of that. It's a small portion of the 8%. We're down anywhere from 20 to 25, even upwards of 30 positions at any given time. We've a ton of people that are looking for jobs elsewhere. Trying to keep these schools up. If you've walked through the schools at all, you can see, of course, the high schools are under major construction, but the other schools, we're barely keeping them up and running. Ton of summer school sites, it's gonna be difficult to make up for all the damage that's been done in the schools, and just the wear and tear on the schools with the amount of staffing that we have now currently. So I ask you, please, for the safety of the schools, the staff, the buildings, the city of Madison students, please, let's, Dr. Jenkins said, we got tough times, all for tough decisions. And I think there was one group that was left out of that tough decision. And we've always worked with the district as hard as we could to make things flow, snow removal. So that school can actually open, not to mention a million emergency situations that happen in the schools. So if anybody has any other questions on that, my phone's always open. I appreciate your time. I welcome you. And thank you for your time.
Thank you. Okay, that concludes the public comment portion of our meeting. On to agenda item 3.1. I move to approve the minutes from the operations work group meeting dated May 8th, 2023.
Second.
Second, board member Muldrow. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries. Okay, moving on to item 4.1. This past weekend and week, we had our high school graduations and finished the last day of school for the school year. So we have this nice 2-minute video prepared by staff for us to celebrate students as they move on to new things in life. All right, thank you. Moving on to our main topic of tonight, we are nearing the end of our preliminary budget process before a final vote in June to approve this preliminary budget. And so I want to give credit to this group for navigating a difficult fiscal environment while maintaining our commitment to serving every child and an educator in this district to the greatest extent possible. Through the hard work of everyone involved here tonight and across the district and all of our buildings and all areas, there are successes and accomplishments we can celebrate, acknowledge in this budget, and including our maintenance of staff to student ratios in school buildings, our largest investment in staff wages in recorded history, and our continued investment in important projects like full day 4K, arts programming, and wraparound services for students and families like health clinics and community schools. Our work is not done. We still face a lot of adversity and challenge. As a significant portion of this budget does use one-time funding as well as running a budget deficit. So over the coming months, we will learn more about how we can reduce spending and raise revenue to maintain the budget of this district. Our specific task tonight is to review our work to date and to review submitted board member amendments, review the staff analysis of such amendments, and have a productive dialogue about those amendments. So tonight is an opportunity to ask questions about the amendments themselves and the analysis of those amendments prior to a vote at the end of the month on June 26th. Board members can also ask questions and amend their amendments over the coming 2 weeks prior to that board meeting. So Ross, take us away.
Good evening, everyone. Before I start tonight, I just wanted to acknowledge that the last 4 days have seen a lot of activity on the state level. I had actually submitted this presentation to Jesse on Wednesday for final review, to come back on Thursday morning and find out that something had happened. Wednesday, we got news from the state that they were expecting a stalemate and that no action on the budget was going to come forward before July. 18 hours later, there is a tentative arrangement being discussed. I want to say very clearly discussed, and that has hit many news cycles, papers, and the news media as well. I should point out that everything we're learning about this potential compromise is not finalized. There is not an agreement before the governor to be signed. However, my staff and I have been working to incorporate that information so we can have this update that will inform our discussion later in June. I'm hopeful that nothing will change between now and then, but if it does, we're going to have to address it pretty short time frame. So I appreciate your patience. So tonight we're going to start our meeting like we do most of our work group meetings and board meetings, stating our goals, that every child is on track to graduate ready for college, career, and community. The district and every school in it is a place where children, staff, and families thrive, and African-American children and youth excel in school. As Savion mentioned in the introduction, we are nearing the end of our initial budget book cycle, where we start by establishing our goals and guiding principles within our administration team and with the board. We create our revenue forecast, assumptions, and projected enrollment, develop our baseline staffing plan as needed, our compensation strategy. We identify and fund our district's excellence and equity projects, and we finalize our healthcare and benefit negotiations. In the month of June, we are at the point where, again, we're finalizing our budget input and amendment process that we started last month. And we are preparing for our regular board of meeting vote at the June 26th meeting. For tonight, we are going to go over some of the highlights of the budget book updates and the rebalancing efforts we've been doing in the last week, discussing further the state budget status and outlook for the next couple of months, identify and summarize some of the board member inputs and inquiries and amendments that have been submitted from the last week, an update on our property taxes for June, and the budget book production and next steps. So in the last week, we've learned a lot, but I'm going to summarize these in the next couple of slides by stating what we know right now. 23-24 was the first year of the 23-25 biennium budget. The budget information is not finalized, but there has been an indication of potential compromise at the state level as of June 8th. It is still coming out daily, and these details will need to be reviewed for the June meeting discussion if there are any further changes. On the local side, this is the final year, 23-24, of our operating referendum. This is built into all of our calculations and has been since our discussion started last January. We are experiencing declining enrollment still, which will cut into our perpetual authority at the operating level and hold harmless due to our low calculation of the revenue limit, continues to erode our base revenue over the last couple of years. And the per pupil adjustment for 23-25 is not finalized, but we do have numbers to discuss. Also, in June, the Board of Education authorized the administration to incorporate an 8% cost of living adjustment into the 23-24 budget. This is also during the highest rate of inflation in over 40 years, while we're experiencing unprecedented staffing and teacher shortages. And while state spending for education has fallen behind the national average. And while charter and voucher spending continue to deplete public school resources. Next 12 months, we will have some difficult decisions to balance our current and future budgets. And we may need to discuss the potential to pursue additional funding sources. Some of the implications or a summary by the numbers of what we're talking about. The 23-24 preliminary budget is not balanced. This has been identified back in April and continues for the current budget. Current compensation planning at 8% matches the rate of inflation. But we need to discuss how we got here. So including our operationally funded ESSER positions, the operational budget deficit is just north of $27 million for 23-24. The net deficit, after we identify that we have taken some existing positions and placed them on ESSER for next year, means that the budget for June will show an operational deficit of about $15 million. The state budget decisions around revenue limit may bring this down or alter it further, but will not eliminate the deficit we're currently looking at. This budget also includes some pretty hefty increases to healthcare and transportation that are also driving this current deficit. The revenue limit is set to increase approximately 2.3%, 2% net of what we will have to pay out to voucher programs. I'll get to that in a bit. The increase to charter payments based on last week's news is considerable. The voucher payment increase for K-8 districts throughout the state are increasing over 13%. The 9-12 voucher payments for K-12 districts in Wisconsin are increasing over 32%. This will increase our net cost to vouchers at about $1.15 million, which we will receive an exemption for, but we're serving as a tax pass-through for those programs that we'll have to pay out next year. In addition, the 2X charter payments are anticipated to increase about 19% for 23-24. This will increase our net 2X payments for next year about $2.8 million. Unlike the voucher programs, this does not have a matching revenue source. This will come out of our own revenue limit and our own resources. Quick discussion on fund balance, what it is, what it's used for, and why do we keep discussing it. Fund balance represents a point in time, namely June 30th of a given fiscal year, where a district is required to report the difference between all assets and liabilities on hand. Assets can include cash, they can include buildings, they can include liabilities such as payrolls that have not yet been paid but are incurred the prior year. It is the number represented at the end of a fiscal year. Now, the annual budget performance does drive a change in fund balance, but it does not represent cash in hand at any given time. Current board policy dictates fund balance should be between 10 and 15%. And when we talk about fund balance, we also have to identify cash flow. Cash flow is a point where is a issue where we need to have enough cash on hand to pay our bills and pay our teachers. We do a short-term borrowing every single year in September because we are cash poor. Most of our revenue comes from property taxes, and our property tax bills come in January. So we don't receive the first half of our major revenue source until 6 months into the fiscal year. 7 months into the fiscal year. This essentially means the district has no cash to operate by the beginning of October, which is why we short-term borrow in the first place. So, quick update on the budget book, which we're currently working to redo for the June regular meeting. You'll see here that the operational funds, funds 10 and 27, our general and special education funds, are showing a deficit of approximately $15 million going into the June discussions. Some highlights on this chart is that a reduction in mobile property taxes and TIF revenues are changing mostly because of aid loss. Due to some increases we've been discussing the last couple of years on our property values as a district, our cost per student and our property value per student is creating a ratio where we're going to have less and less aid to work with each year, which means we have to put more on the property taxes. Our changes in overall spending is also driven by removal of one-time resources identified during the budget development process. And our current budget variance to operate is representative and increased by the decision to move to 8% CPI, in addition to changes in our insurance carriers and transportation contracts. Moving on to our public input and amendments that we received through the month of May. The next couple of slides, I have 4 slides identifying some of the summarized information from amendments submitted to the administration for review. I've shared all the draft responses to these amendments in weekly updates to the board. And tonight I wanted to identify how these themes came together and which are included in the budget for June and which are not included for the budget for June at this point. First amendment is coming from multiple board members, actually, identifying a desire to increase wages or to increase staff compensation to match CPI. Response to this is pretty straightforward since we've discussed it already a couple of times this evening. Increase to staff compensation will create additional expenses beyond current revenues. The state budget information may improve the outlook once it's finalized, and this has already been incorporated into the 23-24 preliminary budget for July 1st, 2023 direction. Next is acknowledgement of the Operation Fresh Start board amendment to restore the 0.5 teaching position. Restoring this position can be done at the pleasure of the board using building unallocated resources. And this at this point has already been incorporated into the 23-24 budget for July 1st per board direction. Third one, custodial staff pay increase from multiple board members. The request is to add an hourly wage increase to all custodial staff for 23-24. Response to this is that the board has already directed the administration to increase base wage by 8% in the June preliminary budget. This includes all custodial staff. At this point, the discussion around what hourly increase to include is still under debate by board members and is not currently included in the June budget. An increase of $5 an hour for reference will increase expenses approximately $2.8 million and will increase the existing deficit at this point. And finally, restoration of positions. The request is to return FTE to 22-23 levels at all schools using reserve funds and allocate additional FTE to all sites to bring class sizes and caseloads down using reserve funds. Response to this identifies that budget amendment references positions that were reduced due to enrollment decline paired with reductions to filled positions with contracts already issued to staff. The impact of reversing the staff workbook process would have a significant impact on the budget, upwards of $5 million. It is unclear what adjustments to staffing levels are being specifically adjusted in this amendment and require further discussion during future budget development. As such, this is not currently included in the June preliminary budget. Before we move on to that, actually, no, we can move on to property tax at this point. Quick update on property taxes. Again, this is late breaking information following last week's announcement. The increase in the revenue limit is proposed to be $325 per pupil for both years of the biennium. This is the single highest increase in the revenue limit since the beginning of revenue limits in 1993. However, under our current situation, in addition to the revenue limit at this point, means that all of that authority will move on to taxes, unfortunately. We are at the maximum aid loss threshold right now at 15%, so additional authority under the revenue limit would follow to tax levy only. This will change before October, but based on the data we have right now, the tax rate will be decreasing approximately 8.8%, meaning that the amount taxed per $1,000 of property value will be decreasing 87 cents per thousand. The city assessor data, which we received shortly after the April board meeting, identifies the average home value will be increasing approximately 12.6%. As such, the equalized value for the entire footprint of MSD is expected to increase approximately 14.6%. Historically, we've seen about a 2% variance between change in equalized value and assessed value. This means that even though the tax rate is going down considerably, one of our lowest decrease or highest decreases in the tax rate itself, the average homeowner increase will be approximately $104 moving into the fall planning. And with that, I'll open it up to questions.
Thank you. I see Board Member Vandermeulen.
Yes, I was on the EA amendment. I think that we had put one in, but I'm not sure if it was taken out in the weekly update. So I was curious on what happened to that one. And then my second question is, if the governor's plan passes, does it cover the increase from 25% to 33% on special education? Is that added in?
That is in here right now. And it still represents an increase of 3.33% over current.
I wasn't sure. Some reason I thought it was 4, but I must have done the math wrong, and knowing me, I probably flipped something somewhere.
To address your first question, in the weekly update, I identified the reason for the EA change was tied to one-time federal funds. And that after July 1st, every year, the special education team adds additional staff to the CC and SEA component, moving into all based on IEP meetings throughout the summer.
The problem being is, may I speak, Chair?
Yep.
The problem is that those staff don't necessarily come back, is what I'm worried about. I've talked to not just several teachers, but several principals who have left or are leaving, worried about, or are here and worried about their special ed allocations. And I'm worried that if we don't even increase some that come fall, we're going to end up paying twice as much for people, not as many people, and those who may not be licensed without an emergency license. And I do worry about that. So those are my 2 concerns. And that's all my questions, Chair.
Board Member Muldrow.
I want to start by thanking you, Ross, for the work you've done on this budget and all of the budgets since I've been on the board. You've been heavily involved in the work we do, and you have presented us our options with incredible clarity and responsibility towards our greater community. And for that, I think we all owe you a lot of appreciation. I want to talk specifically about the 8%, the impact of the 8%. I want to start with questions specific to the custodial unit. So last year, when we gave the $5 increase, one of the things I said was that nobody in our district should be making, less than $20 an hour. You can make $20 an hour delivering pizza for Ian's. Does the 8% push our custodial staff above $20 an hour? What does our average custodial staff make per hour? And my estimation was that 8% is about $1.80 increase. So if we're talking about getting to $5, part of what we did last year is that we got to $5 by acknowledging the increase we had already given. So we would be $1.80 towards $5, which would mean that $5 has turned into $3.20. That's my understanding as of right now. Ross, is that consistent with your math?
Quick math right now. My computer's not cooperating. At this point, yes, the 8% increase would ensure that the custodial base pay would be right at about $20 an hour for trainees. The range beyond that, which would be the custodial worker 1, is already $20 an hour.
Mm-hmm. So that's getting everybody over $20 an hour. And can you compare that to the folks who received the $5 increase? So are our custodial staff making significantly less than our food services staff or our SCAs?
No, actually, they're very similar in that regard.
Okay. The custodial unit is one of the only units that has a pretty significant overtime expense, meaning when we're short-staffed custodial workers, the expense is significant. When you and I talked about it, I thought it was around $800,000 for this year, so pretty close to
Actually higher than that now.
Can you give me that exact number?
Over $1 million.
It's over $1 million in overtime. So I think factoring in that amount, were we to say invest an additional $3.20 an hour in addition to, would that come out to be more significant than the $1 million we're paying in overtime, or how would that impact overtime? Were we able to attract more people, stabilize that staff, and actually needed less overtime because we had a better staffed custodial unit?
Based on the math we did prior to discussion around 8%, a $5 an hour increase would cost them approximately $2.8 million across all units. So if I'm using averages or ratios, 320 would be more than half that amount. So that would be bit more than $1 million, be about 1.6.
Okay.
Mental math there.
I think my last question with respect to kind of how the 8% impacts our custodial unit specifically is looking at cost savings generated by vacancy. A lot of times when you're talking about cost savings and you're talking about educators, you don't necessarily factor in overtime as part of it. With custodial staff, we'll have the vacancy, but then and maybe have the cost savings, although maybe that vacancy will actually end up costing us more per hour based in overtime. Can you talk to me about any cost savings that we've generated related to vacancies in that unit?
For the current year, we've had on average just north of 25 of the year. You are correct, though, most of which in savings we would have had for unfilled positions has gone directly to overtime. And at this point, I think the overtime has more than swallowed up most of those savings.
I really appreciate you speaking to that. I think those are factors we need to take into consideration as we continue to have this conversation. And I want to thank our custodial folks for continuing to show up and advocate and working with us and being tremendously understanding to the difficulty of our current reality. My last couple of questions are specific to the implications of the 8% in the long term. And I did send you these questions, Ross, so I don't know if you'd prefer that I kind of go back and find them in weekly update, but I do think they're important for the public. So last year, when we gave the $5 increase, one of the reasons I'm not going to support the amendment to restore the positions, not because I don't agree that we need well-staffed schools, but it's because you made it very clear to us when we went for $5 that we would have to make a reduction based on enrollment of a little over 100 positions in order to balance our budget after we made that decision. In order to balance our budget after we decided on 8%, how many staff would we be looking at cutting next year?
I don't want to speculate too far on this, but we also don't know what's going to happen next year in regards to inflation. 8%, I'm sorry, the highest it ever got was just over 9%, and it's currently under 6% and falling. So if we estimate CPI next December and planned at an average around 4%, maybe, you're still talking about a pretty hefty variance going into 24-25. And if we maintain status quo, you're talking about a net reduction of about 300 plus positions.
I think that that's a really important thing for us to sit with. And I think that there's nothing more important we could do right now, or more important that we have done, than invest in the people who make this district possible. And I think we are going to have kind of a real conversation about the consequences of going to 8% and the implications of that kind of spending. This year, we had a significant amount of cost savings related to vacancies among teachers and administrators. That was not swallowed up by overtime. Can you talk me through what that cost savings looked like?
We did have a little over 100 positions vacant throughout the entire year. That is true. However, we've had a number of expenses this year that we've needed to plan for, were not originally in the fall budget. Namely, discussions that's already come before the board in regards to our current our current capital maintenance referendum. Last March, we identified that the referendum was costing us about $28 million beyond the original authority. All of that money is still being made up through use of one-time money from fund balance, in addition to operational savings. And those are things that we need to make sure are covered before the end of the referendum, presumably after this summer. We just finished our final borrowing for this. We want to make sure that any other cost changes or discussions that need the board's attention will come back before the board from the maintenance team as we move on. Aside from that, we did take some opportunity in previous years to do an advance payment of some of our debt schedules to free up money for the existing budget. All of these things are activities we can take to plan ahead for future operating authority, but we certainly still have use of some of these operational savings for needs to run the district going forward.
It's hard to imagine doing this without you, Ross. I really appreciate you. I think the last thing I want to say is there's been 3 times on this board since I've been on this board for 4 years, where we have passed the highest cost of living increase in the history of the organization, including last year. Last year, we came in at 3%. I'd never seen anything larger than that in my entire time of following this district. 8% is beyond unprecedented. It is more than double the largest increase we have ever given in the past. And it is one of the most strategic investments in educators I think we could make as a district. And I think that investment, has to matter and has to be promoted in ways that are positive and realistic towards the long-term consequences. And so I guess my final question for you, Ross, is how do we balance the conversation about the need to invest in our educators and the need to get back to a balanced budget?
Well, there's no real short way to say it. There's going to be some tough discussions that are going to succeed me after I depart from the district later this month. But there still needs to be stronger and more vocal advocacy at the state level. Some of the things I've walked the board through over the last couple of years identify what has happened in the last decade to K-12 funding. Some statistics we probably haven't discussed in a while is we used to have a national average of 11th highest in spending for all 50 states. We have now fallen to 25th, and we're continuing to fall. A lot of the things that occurred after Act 10 was implemented back in 2012 are still not resolved. Now, it is true that this revenue limit per pupil adjustment this year is the first time we've actually climbed above the reduction we took back in 2012 to the revenue limit. That being said, some of the unintended consequences, or maybe intended consequences, depending on who you talk to, about what happens when you provide no increase to the only elevator you can give districts to increase their revenue streams, which is the revenue limit. If you hold that at a zero for 6 out of the last 10 years, the formula that's used to dictate how much money we are able to raise not only gets pinched, it gets eroded. This whole discussion around hold harmless, which I know are the 2 words you never want to hear again, are around basically indicate your entire reason for being has calculated lower than the previous year. Here's a safety net. By the way, it's gone next year. That's the discussion around hold harmless I've tried to have now for several years. It has taken millions of dollars away from this district that we could be reinvesting in our community. Those impacts aren't being discussed. It's all about the 2-year cycle, and it's all about what can be discussed at the Capitol and given to us with maybe 2 weeks to spare at this point. It's not enough time. It's not enough time to plan. It's not enough time to be meaningful. But to your question about budget balancing, you asked me for a number earlier about what positions it would take. It's going to be north of 300 positions if we only go that way. Otherwise, we really have to look at cost reductions around entire programming, or heaven forbid, we look at our schools if we need to restructure somehow.
I appreciate that. And I guess I would say in closing, that's it for my questions, but my gratitude for you, Ross, is immense. And my gratitude for our greater community is something that I think, I'm amazed by our community's ability to support our schools throughout this pandemic, and our community's commitment to our educators and our children. I think when we talk about raising taxes, we're talking about people's real lives. And I think to talk about the average homeowner seeing an increase of about $100 a year, when we know that renters are seeing increases of hundreds of dollars a month, is something we have to take into consideration. The other thing I want to point out, because we are a body of governance, is that the county was able to give their staff an 8% increase because they have the sales tax. And when the cost of goods goes up, the way that they are taxed goes up. And the school district shouldn't be in a situation where we can't keep up with inflation, especially when there are mechanisms for other bodies of government to access the resources they need to do their work with integrity. We as a district have to ensure the integrity of our services. And I think that means fighting for the funding that our schools deserve. That's it for me, Chair.
May I ask a point of
Board
order?
Member Vandermolen.
Point of order, regardless of the discussions here, the ones that, the amendments that have been put in still move on to the discussion on the 26th, correct?
We will have an opportunity to vote on the amendments on the 26th.
That's all I needed to know. That's all my question.
Any other board member, Commissioner Felton?
Yeah, thank you. I don't know how to make it a question. I guess. When we're in difficult budgetary situations and we are facing cuts to school staff. Whether or not they mirror enrollment, like, I don't always. So the rhetoric around like the ratio staff to student ratio doesn't always like really turn it up for me, partly because I know that like even though kids can leave the building, right, the school still needs all those adults to run, and like any given adult has so many hats and just so much across a school that like the ratio staying the same doesn't always like doesn't always ring true for me as like, okay, it's gonna be fine. I just have a hard time where there's so much spending on strategy, where there's so much spending on external professional development designed to align schools across the board. When in my experience, schools are struggling to align within the building. Like the idea of being able to align across, right? Say, oh, we're gonna have the same across the board, like just like they were talking about how it is for OFS, right? Like this, the same across the board is not necessarily going to produce the outcomes that we think it will. And I guess when you talked, just to answer board member Muldra's fantastic questions, like you say, oh, well, we have to look at some additional cost savings. Can you talk to me about what has been the like discussion around some of those things? And like, I know that the budget book always makes it look like, oh, we're actually, it's not ballooning administrative costs, and it isn't like that. But like in my experience, it really feels like that, because like what school staff are hearing is, okay, now this year we're going to do X, Y, Z, ABC, all new, coming out of ABC different departments that we've contracted with consultants externally to push forward a strategic vision that's like very high in the sky and can be really, really divorced from the reality in the schools. And to whatever extent you have been a part of those, like, which one conversations, can you talk about what people are using to make those choices and to have those discussions about like, okay, what's really going to be a thing that impacts the student experience and the student outcomes?
I can't get specifically into detail around student outcome, but I can tell you that when priorities are selected, when they're at least proposed, the administrative team meets and discusses their impacts, and my involvement usually comes in towards the end when identifying what we're planning for, what we're costing out, what options are going where. So I don't think I can adequately answer the entirety of your question, but there is a process identified internally that we discuss everything that's coming forward. In a better year, we would have said, we have this much to discuss around new ideas. We haven't been able to have that discussion in a couple of years. Now it's either one time or it's not happening.
You know, it's one time or it's not happening.
Lately, the last 3 years, it's been ESSER or nothing.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Thanks.
Real quick, Cindy, I saw that you popped up. Did you have anything to contribute or? Just that? No pressure.
No, good evening, everyone. The only thing I would add, good evening, Board Member Feltham, and thank you for your question. Can you hear me okay? I think the only thing that I would add to what you asked is that the decision-making around sometimes what seems to be large-scale purchases is always aligned to our district priorities. In the past, it was really heavily aligned to our strategic framework, the goals in the framework, and kind of what we put in terms of our priority areas. I would say over the last few years, we've really aligned it to the priorities that we've also put in the SIP, and those have been literacy or early literacy and beyond, culture and climate, and then family engagement. And then the last thing I would say that drives decisions is the data in terms of where we're seeing real opportunities for improvement. But as Ross indicated, most of those decisions in the last 2 years have been based on the use of ESSER funds and how ESSER outlined those 5 priority areas as well.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah.
I'm curious, and stop me if this is a question that is beyond the scope of notice for this meeting. Do we expect that, I guess to preface it, like I'm speaking from my experience, where the priorities that you describe coming from the strategic framework that you describe do not always match the priorities that are coming up from the schools. And I wonder if you expect that the strategic framework recalibration work will bring those sort of like back on board so that they're more closely aligned, so that when we're making hard decisions about cost saving measures, it feels or it seems or it is more like shared at all levels of the organization. I don't mean the cost savings. I mean the agreement upon where to find the cost savings. Is that part of the expectation from that strategic calibration?
I don't know if that's specifically written into the work of the strategic framework recalibration, but I think that's the direction we're trying to go. I think even in naming culture and climate and literacy has been in collaboration with our schools, with our school staff. We've been really trying to use the school's SIP, their school improvement plan, as the driver to think about then what does that mean for big decisions we have to make centrally or systemically. I think that is a good recommendation and for us to consider, but I don't know if that will live directly with the strategic framework recalibration.
Thanks.
Board Member Vandermillen.
Yes, this is more a statement. It's more of an answer to Blair's question than anything else. We've always done what Cindy said is correct, and we've done it that way. What used to happen, and this is on my first term before it was changed, was when we had a lower, when you could only spend 20,000 and then get board approval. Now anything under 35, you don't need board approval. That's probably the main difference between the two. And that's the only major change that we did, but it was significant. If that helps explain anything. And that's all I have.
Any other board member questions? Board Member Nichols.
Thanks. Hey, Ross, for the amendment to restore the OFS position, it says that you've incorporated that back in. Can you tell me, is that coming from unallocated or where is that coming from?
That is coming from unallocated.
Okay, thank you.
I'll add myself to the queue. Ross, you mentioned that we are at a budget deficit right now. May I ask how large that is specifically?
I'll refer back to a slide from earlier because I want to make sure this is understood correctly. If when reading the budget book, you're wondering what the deficit is operationally for 23-24, the answer is just under $15 million. Had we not put some existing positions from our regular budget onto ESSER to finish out the ESSER funding, that gap would be more like $27 million today.
Okay. And so there was a conversation about fund balance. What are the consequences of putting operation expenditures on fund balance?
Operational spending from fund balance shows the problem with district financial health, namely, it tells our lenders that we do not have enough revenue to sustain our operations, and it may impact our bond rating going into the immediate future. It also will begin to erode our position on fund balance policy. again, this is preliminary, but based on expected performance for the end of this year and going into next year, we could find ourselves at close to 11% by the end of next year if everything occurs as planned.
Okay. And so if our bond rating is affected, does that affect interest payments?
It does. A change in your bond rating tells anyone bidding on your debt that you are a higher risk or you get less bidders. So you could get a higher interest rate from your potential bidders, or you could get less competition, which usually drives interest rates up even further.
Yeah, so in effect, our operating budget could be squeezed even tighter if our interest rates go up.
In our short-term borrowing, yes. It also would affect any future bond issues for debt issues related to capital maintenance. If we had another capital referendum in 8, 10 or 4, 8, 10 years, whatever that may be, whatever prevailing interest rate we get on that would also be affected.
Thank you. Any other board member questions? One moment, board member Van der Molen. Any other members who have not spoken? All right, board member Van der Molen.
Just quick clarification. I know Michelle asked on the Operation Fresh Start, is this related to that amendment or is that related to the janitorial amendment, or is that just in general? I got kind of confused.
As am I. The question that board member Nichols had was, is the OFS position being restored from unallocated? The answer is yes.
Thank you. And then okay, that's where okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Ross, can I add something?
Sure.
I just want to reemphasize that we do carry a healthy unallocated going into next fall, right? It's still pretty early. We're in June, we have July, August, and up until the third Friday in September. There is a process for use of unallocated. That is the perfect use of it for Operation Fresh Start. I mean, that's why we have unallocated, to address where we see needs emerge, either on the high end or on the low end. So just wanted to reinforce for folks. I want to first of all thank you, Ross, for having the foresight to build that into the budget. And also just be clear that we will use that unallocated if there are adjustments that need to be made along class sizes at specific grades in content areas. It's a very tight process between now and the third Friday in September. And then we owe the board those class size reports as per policy twice a year. So I know that the team is working really hard to manage that unallocated and not spend it down right now. We've got lots that can happen between now and August, right? Lots of changes happen with families, and we're watching no-show lists. We have our admin assistants and principals reaching out starting in August to find out who's coming to school, who's actually enrolling, who might be unenrolling. So we keep pretty close tabs on that. So I just wanted to reinforce and thank Ross and the team prior to my even arriving for establishing that. And that's exactly what we draw from if and when adjustments are needed, and we monitor that very closely. And I would just also like to say before and Ross, I want to thank you for your service to this district. I've known you for 19 years and just grateful for your friendship and colleagueship, and wish you only the best.
I think you've known me longer than that.
Maybe I didn't, maybe I have known you longer than that, since you were in third grade.
Second grade.
Yo.
Is that a fact?
I'm a second grade teacher.
Agent Lisa.
Second grade teacher.
Board member Pearson.
Yeah, thank you. So I just had a few questions just about our fund balance, and then also just utilizing monies out of unallocated. And so I guess, like, thank you, Lisa, for stating like how the unallocated is used and how we want to use it. And the caution of also trying to put many things on unallocated and spending that down. You know, I wholeheartedly agree with that. I guess my question is just, Ross, if you can just, I know I understand this, but the public might not understand it as much, of like, how are we adding monies to unallocated, like our balances around that? If we are spending it down, and how are we adding it? Where does it come from?
Sure. So the establishment of unallocated is part of our annual staffing workbook process. Where after we're doing our initial pass of what happens to enrollment-based reductions at the building level. We don't take all allocation out of the building at that time and produce it as a budgetary alignment cut, right? We hold some of that FTE to the side and say, you know what, this is very early in the process. We need to plan around what enrollment impact we think we're going to have based on our projections, but something will change between January and September. So the idea of identifying unallocated gives us the opportunity to adapt as enrollment occurs over the summer. We can say, oh, that progression from 5th to 6th grade from this building to this building was way off. We now need to allocate additional resources to maintain our class size policy at that building. Those discussions happen every year and basically throughout that 8-month process in January and August, right? So it's not in addition to the budget, it's actually in identifying what we've already pulled back in the workbook process. We don't eliminate the entire amount that gets pulled back. We put part of it to the side. So in essence, it's already part of the existing year budget. It's just we're now sitting on it for next year for that purpose that Lisa mentioned.
Yeah, thank you for that explanation. Hopefully folks understand it a little more when as we're talking about unallocated and other terms. And then also with the fund balance, what is the just so that public kind of understands, what is like the lowest that we can go per our policies and per our state statutes for our fund balance?
The lowest per our board policy is 10%.
Mhm.
There is in the, right, and you try and find it.
Sorry, sorry to do some gotcha questions.
See if I can find it right now.
I mean, as you find it, I just ask these questions just because I think we've asked these before in some meetings prior to this, but just so that folks that might be joining in with us that understand like that even if we have a fund balance, a hefty amount, that doesn't necessarily mean that we want to keep using it. And there are limits in which we can use it.
So just to clarify, because I wanted to pull this directly out of the quote from the budget book. State statutes do not require that a set amount or percent of a district's overall budget be maintained as a fund balance. This is a local decision. So locally, we do have a policy that dictates our fund balance should be between 10 and 15%, but there is not a requirement to have a policy around that.
Got it. And what are like the repercussions if we were to change that?
To change what?
If we were to change the policy to decrease it or just get rid of it, just in case there might folks that might be having that question.
I mean, the policy is set as a guidance measure for the board and the administration to follow. If we wanted to adapt a new policy, we certainly could. Again, there does not seem to be a statutory requirement to have a fund balance policy. And the only best practice I can reference is what I've seen around the state is that the desire around fund balance is to pursue a point at which you no longer need short-term borrow. It should be in excess of our current threshold of 50%. But I just say that as my discussions around the state.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much, Ross. That's all my questions. Thanks.
How much do we have in fund balance?
At the start of this year, we ended last year at 97.4 million. Some of which was 16.5 was identified as assigned fund balance for things that were in process but not paid as of June 30th of last year. We also had some money identified under restricted and non-spendable for things like tangible assets or funding that can only be used for specific purposes.
So that was at the beginning of the year. What is it now?
I don't have a number for you right now because it's not June 30th and we haven't closed the books yet.
Oh, yeah, good point. Sorry about that, Ross. I'm used to you doing magic, so I just.
That goes back to when I brought up fund balance earlier, is it's a point in time, and the only time I can give it to you is after the audit's complete.
Got it.
Any further board member questions? Board member Simkin?
Russ, I'm wondering, how much did we pay over the last year in interest for loans?
I have to look that up and get back to you. I don't have that out of the top of my head. We've got our capital maintenance and we've got our short-term borrowing. I don't have those figures in my head right now.
I'm really thinking about the short-term borrowing that's connected with the fund balance.
I will look into that and I'll get it to you. I don't have it.
Moving on to item 6.1, a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Second, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
We are adjourned.